Alright, hello and welcome ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. My name is Eric and this is the other CEDH, where the C stands for casual. We are your one-stop shop for all things casual kitchen table Magic the Gathering. Thank you for joining me here today. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, today we're going to be diving right into episode 3 of tips and tricks for beginning EDH players. We've already looked at some general advice for playing the game in episode 1, and in episode 2 we looked at how to improve your threat assessment. So what are we going to cover on episode 3? Well, today we're going to be looking at improving your deck building skills. Contained within are some not so hidden gems of worldly wisdom provided to you by a guy who's kind of a hack but whose mind never shuts up and just really likes to play Magic. All kidding aside, I'm going to provide you with some tips and tricks for helping your decks perform more consistently, and will hopefully give you the inspiration you need to start making your decks better and hopefully win more games. Winning more games, or even just having a bigger impact on the game, will mean more fun for you as a player, in which case you will play more, get better at the game, and hopefully start putting more hash marks in your win column. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Tip number 5, keep extensive records of your decks. So a little bit of insight into my boring ass life. Anytime I work on making a new deck list and a new deck tech for this channel, I always write out a deck list in my computer's word processor. If I'm building a deck and don't have all the cards I need, I separate the lists into cards I have and cards I need to buy. In a second Word document, I break the deck down into the categories I cover in the deck tech, which are main ramp card draw, insert degenerate and disgusting thing that this deck wants to do on an obscenely unreasonable level, and how are we going to win this game. I also put the list up on Tapped Out as soon as I have it complete so that I can take a look at the mana distribution and mana curve just to make sure that everything looks correct and none of these categories are too far out of whack. This may sound like a tedious endeavor, but I think it will pay off in the long run, especially for newer players that are just building their first decks. Having everything typed out in front of you and having everything categorized will help you make sure that your decks have the correct amount of resources and enough of the tools that you will need to help remove your opponent's threats and get your own win conditions online so that you can win the game. It is also helpful to have a deck list handy so that if you need to make adjustments and tweak your deck, you can very easily see what you took out and can very easily adjust the list to reflect what you put in. You might even want to keep multiple iterations of your deck lists handy so you can see what adjustments you have made, how your deck has evolved, and how you may need to tweak the deck so that it will be a good fit in different metas if you guys play in a lot of different metas. I have a lot of seats at a lot of different commander tables. Some of you may only play with the same 2 or 3 people, but nevertheless, keeping a list of all your deck building endeavors I think will be surprisingly beneficial for you. Tip number 4, run plenty of removal, but also run the right kind of removal. If you play with the same people consistently, you'll start to notice that some forms of removal are better than others. Are you in a meta that has a lot of creatures? If so, run plenty of board wipes like your Fumigate and End Hostilities. Are you playing against a deck that creates a ton of tokens? Some people may call for it to be banned, but Cyclonic Rift is your friend here. Are you in a meta with a bunch of high-powered degenerates that are racing to assemble their Doomsday Machine? Stop them in their tracks with counter spells. There are a ton of good ones out there, and you can even find them in colors outside of blue. It wouldn't be an episode without mentioning my buddy Dan. I'll drag his ass onto the show one of these days, maybe when I make my episode about learning how to mulligan, because believe me, no one knows better about throwing away a first hand than Dan does. Anyway, Dan has a deck that is run by Zedru the Great-Hearted. It's the deck that everyone hates to play against because it's like some kind of drug-fueled Midnight Madness special where we're practically giving things away. Except all the merchandise is a cavalcade of pain and nightmarish annoyances, because Dan will not hesitate to aggressive mining the shit out of you. Ouch. Anyway, that deck runs a Torpor Orb, which actually shuts off a lot of removal in our meta, things like your Reclamation Sage, your Bane of Progress, and even things like Acidic Slime. Oh, damn, Acidic Slime is such a good card. Anyway, when I sit down against that deck, I know that I might see that Torpor Orb, in which case I have to have removal that can deal with it. So I routinely run things like Decimate and Broken Bond in my decks to make sure that I can always deal with the situation at hand. Tip number 3. This is going to sound like a weird tip, but just bear with me on this one. if you're having trouble figuring out how to build around a certain commander, just read the card and read what the commander actually does. The ability that is printed on your commander will dictate the sort of thing that your deck wants to be doing. I recently started a build of Akiri Lineslinger and Silas Wren Seeker Adept. In reading both of these commanders, it's obvious that they both want a lot of artifacts in play or in the graveyard, with Akiri turning into some sort of artifact-powered Bruce Banner when the board is full of them, and Silas is a guy that no one ever wants to block, and when he hits, he lets you recur any artifacts that you have in your graveyard. Mindslaver, anyone? Yeah, I went there because I'm a horrible person. Anyway, there are other commanders that are going to have a less obvious build path. As a matter of fact, let's go back to Zedru for a second. I have actually sat down against a few different Zedru decks, and they're all wonderfully bizarre, with our buddy Dan's version being all too close to a stack-style grindfest in which games quickly turn into draw, go. But someone in our Facebook EDH group actually talked about building a weapons dealer Zedru build, in which he dropped a bunch of sweet equipment and used Zedru to hand it out to all the other players, which fuels some sort of fever dream version of a game that looks like a cross between American Gladiators and the mosh pit at a Cannibal Corpse show. Now, in all honesty, that kind of Zedru build sounds fun and hilarious. But anyway, if you can't quite figure out what your deck wants to do, get creative and never be afraid to ask for some suggestions from the community, and I think that some of the creative Magic minds out there will really surprise you. Tip number 2, test, tweak, and adjust. Now, I do a lot of brewing, a lot of building, and a lot of tweaking my decks because I play a lot of Commander. Dan and I play every Sunday night. There's a big game at Dan's house every other Friday night when I'm there. And then every Thursday, I'm down at the shop. Shout out to our friends at Red Raccoon Games. They're an awesome LGS and a great place to play Magic and buy all things related to Magic the Gathering. Anyway, as much as I build, I don't always have a large group to play Magic with, but I am fortunate enough to have a wife that knows how to play the game. Now, I should say that my wife is a very green player. I don't mean green as in new, even though she is, but green as in I like to drop creatures and violently smash your face into a bloody pulp. Way to go, babe! Anyway, a lot of the decks that I build are a little outside of this realm, but she is always gracious enough and patient enough to sit down with me and play enough of a game so that I can kind of see how a deck functions and what cuts and adjustments need to be made. I mentioned having to tweak Wirt the Raid Mother in an earlier episode because I thought I had enough ramp, but at 6 mana she really struggled against faster decks. Actually, she kind of still does, but not nearly as much. I should also mention that Wirt got her first win in a 5-player game the other night, so go Raid Mother, woohoo! Anyway, even if you don't consistently have a group of people to play Magic with, you can always just kind of goldfish your deck. Just sit down and play the game as you normally would, draw a card, drop a land, play a spell. Just get a general idea of how fast the deck operates and how long it takes your deck to do what it really wants to do. If your deck doesn't start doing cool stuff until turn, I don't know, like 8 or 9, it's probably a little too slow and you should make adjustments accordingly. And finally, for our last tip, and this is going to be aimed at new deck builders in particular, but it's also good advice for veteran brewers as well. Tip numero uno, if you are just getting into building Commander decks, especially if you are coming to this channel to build your first Commander deck, don't try to play too many colors in the same deck. And if you're just starting out, go with 1 or 2 colors at the very most. A monocolored build is a great entry point for someone just looking to build their first deck. Now, keep in mind all the colors have their strengths and weaknesses, so if you build a monocolored deck for your first deck, there is going to be something that you will lack. But for the most part, you should be able to make any monocolored build work the way that you want it to. Now, blue isn't going to have great ramp, green isn't going to have very many board wipes, red isn't going to have a lot of card draw, white isn't going to have much mana ramp or card draw, but it has some of the best removal in the game. I have to admit that the only decks that I have that run white run another color as well. The only mono white build I ever had was a deck with SRAM, Senior Edificer, and that deck did exactly the sort of thing that you would imagine. Anyway, this goes for veteran brewers too. Even if you have quite a few decks under your belt, if you've never built a 3 or 4 color mana base before, it might seem a little daunting at first, so make sure that you not only have plenty of ramp, but plenty of fixing as well. I mentioned a build that I'm working on with a Carry Lineslinger and Silas Wren Seeker Adept. Now, I ordered all the cards that I needed and am waiting to test the deck out, but the mana base was somewhat daunting to me because I had never built a 4 color mana base from scratch before. Now, the deck has a very nice mana curve, and I think the deck will operate fast enough that I should never have to generate a ton of mana. And since both Akiri and Silas Wren want a lot of artifacts anyway, I'm running all the Cygnus that I can, and I have things like Wander's Twig and Armillary Sphere to make sure that I have the right kind of lands. And there are a lot of the cheaper fetches like the Panoramas in there as well, so I'm thinking it should turn out fine, but we'll see, hopefully in the upcoming episodes. So again, keep your mana base simple to start off with, but as you evolve as a deck builder over time, even if you attempt a more complicated mana base, make sure that you have enough fixing to get the colors that you need. Another good tip is that if you are attempting a complicated mana base, you can always plug your deck into something like Tapped Out and see where the mana distribution is amongst all the colors in your deck. And even if you put a deck list in as a prototype without all the lands, Tapped Out will give you a chart that shows the distribution of colors amongst the cards in your deck so that you can gauge how many of each land type you will need. And while we're at it, guys, one final tip: don't cut lands from your decks. I know that with Wizards' insistence on shoving a new expansion into the wild every time I get up to take a piss, the number of cards in this game is starting to border on the freakishly absurd. And you guys are always going to see the new piece of tech that will go great in your deck. But please don't start cutting lands to put in a time stretch, guys. Come on, seriously. I see a lot of new deck builders that start cutting lands to make room for all the degenerate madness they hope to unleash on the world, but try and keep your land count as close to that 36 or 38 sweet spot. Now, that number may be a little higher in decks that care about lands like Gitrog or Tatiova, but those decks are evil machines that are an exception to the rule. Alright, so anyway, I think that's going to do it for this episode of Tips and Tricks for Beginning EDH Players. As always, feel free to comment, subscribe, and smash that like button. I've said it before, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Twitter. Don't be afraid to drop in and say hi and let us know how you think we're doing on this channel. Again, feel free to shoot me your ideas on what you guys would like to see on upcoming episodes. I feel like our deck techs are doing pretty well. The first episode of this particular series did really well. Our Commander Spotlight on Yarok the Desecrated has done the best on this channel by a country mile. So again, if there's something I haven't covered that you guys would like to see, feel free to drop me a line. Again, my name is Eric, this is the other CEDH, and we'll see you guys next time.